When I first saw this Drukhari Combat Patrol box, I couldn't simply ignore the fact that it was nearly twice the size of the Tau one. However, when I opened this massive box, it became quite clear to me that the Archon inside is, frankly, not a really good looking model. So instead, I'm gonna make a vampire, Drukhari vampire mix that'll be truly worthy of this chunky box and something that'll be awesome on the tabletop. And the first thing I'm gonna do is replace the head bit, which was a little bit more problematic than I expected, as this was a push-to-fit model. For the replacement bit, I decided to take out the Drukhari Combat set, which had a lot of really cool parts. It's also probably the most up-to-date Drukhari model, so they're the highest quality. I originally was going to go for a helmetless head to match the original, but I decided to go with a Sauron looking helmet instead, as I just thought the idea of this really crown looking helmet was just really cool. After measuring it against the neck, I realized that there's going to be a lot of scraping that I need to do. So the first part was cutting off the little circular bit from the Drukhari helmet, as I don't have a socket, and removing a little bit more of the neck. I ended up cutting only a small portion of the bit, as I realized pushing the pliers any further will start damaging the model. So I took out the X-Acto knife and scraped off the last bit, which did leave me with less than perfect fit, so I decided to take out some sprue glue and fix that problem, which I hope will smooth out the connection and provide a little bit more support for the head, making it less likely that it'll accidentally come off while I'm painting it. I also adjusted the rotation of the head a little bit, as previously it was kind of looking like he was looking at his hand for some reason. I took out the exact same Incubi set and looked at different back pieces, which I always forget what these things are called, but I ended up choosing the one with a little bit more of an outwards blade, as I think it'll fit much more in the aesthetic of this Archon. Now I'm simply going to have to scrape away this area and try to create a little hole to insert this little piece, for which I decided to use the X-Acto knife and essentially just scrape away at the area as much as I could. I also decided to grab the old Archon just to make sure the position of the blade will match the original one. The X-Acto knife was the furthest thing from the perfect tool, however, it's the only thing I had on hand that I thought would work really well for doing this. Periodically, I did also add a tiny bit of thin cement just to soften up the area so I would have an easier time scraping it out. I really think I should have found my Dremel tool, which, come to think of it, probably would have done a good job, or I might have just ruined the model entirely. But anyway, I pushed on with the X-Acto knife and I was finally able to wait to scrape away this really nice looking chunk, which allowed me to perfectly insert the back piece and apply some sprue glue just to make sure this part is going to be secure and there's no chance of it coming loose. After which, I left the model to dry for about several hours just to make sure that the sprue glue set, and the first step of the Archpire was finished. Now that the easy part's out of the way, it's time to make sure that when people look at this guy, they'll recognize him as a Drukhari across the battlefield even at a glance. There'll be no doubt in anyone's mind that this is a Drukhari, not a vampire. I suppose they are kind of vampires. For the armor, I decided to use these colors, starting off with airbrushing on some dark sea blue, with which I covered the entirety of the model, and then moved on to a bit of emerald. When airbrushing, I worked very thin, and given the fact that my undercoat was black, all the colors are slightly darker. And for the last step, I airbrushed on a tiny amount of thin mint green. Then I took out a dry brush and applied some of the mint green on its own, dry brushing a model starting from the top and then dragging the brush down, trying my best to not use excessive pressure. For the eyes, I applied a tiny white dot and then airbrushed on some crimson acrylic ink, which was a very quick but also a very effective way to provide this really nice looking OSL effect of these really scary looking glowing eyes. This is the part where it changed my mind, because originally I was going to go for this really pretty looking crimson cloth. However, I decided to hone in on the classic aesthetic of an Archon with this really disgusting looking skin cloak and create something similar in this miniature. So I began painting over the already painted cloak and using these three colors to create different variations of what I imagine to be this very decaying looking skin tone, starting off with very dark colors and transitioning to much paler tones. However, I did sort of desaturate the color a tiny bit too much, so I ended up mixing a much brighter set and going back in, using a lot more of the wine red and a lot more of the cadmium orange. This time, I went in with a very thin glaze just to make sure the previous transitions were still visible, as even though the cloak was desaturated, it did have really nice texture that I enjoyed. I also proceeded to do this really stippling motion with a very bright color to create an idea of that this skin has been stretched very thinly and is beginning to sort of tear in different areas. For all the under armor parts, I just used a bit of rubber black, adding in a tiny amount of white just to create a bit of a transition so that it is just one monotone color. This was also the part where I decided that this armor should look a lot cooler than it does already, and I decided to take out some of the previous colors and started highlighting this armor in this horizontal line texture, starting off with a very thin glaze of mint green and slowly adding in a tiny amount of white and transitioning between that color. Also realizing that I entirely neglected the back blade this whole time. Finally adding a few very bright dots just for what I thought would be the final highlight. Moving on to my watch, which was essentially speed paint green black with a large amount of flow 8. This is not for the faint of heart, as I am applying essentially a large amount of very dark paint to my model that could essentially ruin it. However, I've used this watch recipe in the past many times, and due to the fact that I employ a very massive amount of flow 8, I'm never worried about this step. Once it was dry, I made sure to varnish the model to kill a lot of the gloss that it tends to generate, and reapplied some of the highlights that I essentially dulled down by using the wash, as it does provide a very slight cold tint to a lot of the flat panels, even where it doesn't leave any of the staining. Then using some of the fine red to create these very crimson looking soul stones, adding some white to get these nice pink highlights. For the horns, I went for rubber black, a bit of leather, and then highlighting them with a tiny amount of ivory. I considered going with the more traditional bone-looking colors, but in the end I decided that darker colors will feel a bit more authentic to what this model looks. I also felt that corns that would be too bright would just take away from the very bright-looking armor that I've already painted. For his blade, I decided to go for this very toxic-looking green color, starting off with dark sea blue to provide essentially my dark undercoat, as I didn't want to work off black alone. Then mixing in a tiny amount of frog green just to create my first layer. For this step, even though the green looks extremely bright, it's very thin and so it has quite a transparent property. Once it dries, it'll be much darker. Then I airbrushed on some frog green on its own to create a much more interesting transition on the blade. Mixed in a bit of ice yellow with frog green and about a 50-50% mixture, which I used to create these very interesting energy lines that are flowing within the blade. And then one of the parts that I decided to use this blade wasn't just the fact that it looks really awesome, but also I feel like it matches the lore aesthetic of Drukhari, where their weapons aren't designed to be lethal as much as they're designed to be torturous in nature. Then adding a bit of ice yellow and then proceeding to create more of these highlights and more of these energy lines that are essentially of different strength going inside of the blade. I'm imagining this sword going back to the Sauron crown is a lot more like a wraith. I'm also imagining that a single stab with this blade will generate a massive amount of pain more than just a normal cut would have, going in once again with the whole thematic theme of Drukhari. I then used ice yellow on its own just for the tip and also the edges of the blade. Then using a tiny mid amount of AK fluorescent, I think will bring out a lot more saturation in the blade and smooth out a lot of the areas that I thought were a little bit too harsh. For the metals, I used green stuff rolled bronze and a bit of Vallejo metal color copper, mixing them in about a 50-50 mix once again. I considered applying it to all of the areas, however I decided to choose only the specific parts that I thought would select quite nicely and also create much more of a visual diffusion throughout the model. The metal did turn out extremely bright, so I ended up using some of the exact same wash just to dull them down a little bit, bringing them more in line with what the rest of the miniature looks like. For the base, I simply used a bit of royal purple and then highlighting with a tiny amount of titanium white. Starting off with a very thin glaze of royal purple, then using a bit of royal purple on its own just to create a few highlights on the statue at the bottom. Adding a bit more white for the highlights and then going back in with this acrylic wash to bring out the texture of it. And with that, this awesome looking Archon was finally finished. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, liking and leaving a comment helps out a massive amount. Thanks. Ooh, this is the Drukhari transfer sheet. I actually did not notice that.